Hi, everybody, and welcome to this webinar on Outreach Insights for Diversity. We're going to be applying some insights from the world of social psychology, so a bit of a departure for most of us engineering and engineering technology professionals and students who are on the line today. My name is Erica, and I am presenting this information to you on behalf of the coalition of organizations that puts on National Engineering Month in Ontario. So that would be the Professional Engineers Ontario, OACET, which is the Certified Engineering Technicians and Technologists body, as well as Engineers Without Borders and the Ontario Society of Professional Engineers. So as you might know, National Engineering Month is in March. For those of you who are not organizing on the campaign, it's a very successful campaign that reaches thousands. Last year we reached 30,000 students and grades K to 8, as well as 9 to 12, university students, professionals, as well as members of the general public. This year it looks like we're probably going to be over 300, or at least close to it, in the number of events, and hopefully reaching even more people in person. So this could be just about anything. We've got bridge building competitions, we've got contraption type building type workshops, we've got urban planning type workshops, we've got professional symposia like the Engineering Innovations Forum. There's just a ton of stuff going on, some of it aimed at professionals, as I said, some of it aimed at kids, some of it aimed at the whole family. So definitely encourage you to check out National Engineering Month website. That's nemontario.ca/events to see what's going on. And we have been prepping you, the event organizers, on how to measure your event effectiveness. So through your event scorecards, how to amplify your event, so you're not just talking to the 30 people in the room or so, but you're actually leveraging your messages and your activities so that they reach people beyond the four walls of the room that you're holding your event in live, both through traditional and social media. So that's been a really good addition to the portfolio of skills for our army of volunteers that make National Engineering Month happen. And this year we also put together a new webinar that was all about how to recruit, manage, and retain volunteers. So if you missed any of these and you want to check them out, go to the website and go to Engineering Outreach Resources. There are dashes between the words there. You'll be able to find them there, complete with copies of the slides and a video replay. Today we're going to do a bit more of a big picture topic around diversity, but extremely important, and I'm really excited about this content and excited to have our expert guest speaker with us, who is going to give you lots of information and very tangible, practical tips that you can use in order to make your event even more impactful. So first of all, let's just frame up what we're trying to do here and why we're trying to do it. When we refer to diversity, we're actually meaning any group that has been traditionally underrepresented in engineering and technology fields. Sometimes we use the abbreviation STEM as well: science, technology, engineering, and math. So it could be women, it could be visible minorities. We also think, when we look at the full definition of diversity and the reason that it's a good thing, it's because we want those different perspectives and those different life experiences. We need all those people to chime in to help us solve the more complex problems that we have today. So the profession will absolutely benefit from having more diverse perspectives, a more diverse makeup, in order to solve those complex problems. And we're going to talk about the grand challenges of engineering, which will come up a little bit later in the presentation. Those are sort of the big problems in the world that engineers and technology professionals are working on. So we could see this as there's basically an ROI. When we put resources in and we increase our diversity in the profession, we're going to get this additional value. We're going to get this better output. So there's definitely a business case to be made for diversity. There's also a fairness issue here, because we know that we don't want, from a sort of a social justice perspective, we don't want to be restricting access to opportunity to anyone on the basis of, the color of their skin or their gender or any other sort of inherent human characteristics. We want that full spectrum and participation. So there's just a couple of reasons that we feel that diversity is important. And why would we want to focus a webinar on diversity? Well, since we know that our goal is to attract and retain people from diverse backgrounds, that we will, sometimes we'll refer to them as the stereotyped participants or stereotyped students, which is what Dr. C is going to get into. We want to know how to do it. And as engineering and technology professionals, we put our trust in the science. And when we want to build a bridge, we need to know about materials, the properties of the materials that we're going to build with. We need to know all about the composition of the soil that's underneath the bridge. We need to know, all of the civil engineering and solid mechanics of how the bridge is going to behave. In this case, what we're trying to do is reduce people's sense that they don't belong. We want to reduce their feeling of being included, of feeling confident, and like they belong in the engineering and technology profession, both at a student level and then later on in the profession. So that's the field of social psychology. That is the science that we're turning to at this point. And it's sort of an exciting new world for us to dabble into. And we are, in a very real way, going to do what we do all the time as engineering and technology professionals. We're going to take things that the researchers and the scientists have figured out and put them into practice in the real world through our outreach events in this case. So I don't know about you, but I think that's pretty cool. And Dr. C is going to give us lots of tips and ways for us to do that effectively. Crystal, could you just advance the slide? I don't know why it's not working for me. Okay, everybody, I apologize. It looks like I got disconnected. Can everybody hear me now? Are you able to type in the chat box if you can hear me? Okay, excellent. Thank you. So, did you catch this slide about why we're doing a webinar on diversity? Okay, awesome. So we know that this is the science that we want to trust in. Okay, great. Only 10 seconds. Perfect. Thanks, Tarek. We're putting into practice what scientists and researchers have discovered, and we're going to use it in the real world. So I don't know about you. I think that's really cool, and this is an awesome opportunity. So this comes into play on a practical level in a couple of different places. One, our theme for National Engineering Month this year is There is a Place for You, which is absolutely perfect to demonstrate the theme of diversity, to say that there's a place for everyone. If you're communicative and outgoing, you can be someone on the team who works maybe in a sales engineering role, or someone who does maybe the pitch to get an investor for your new startup company, if you're working in sort of a tech background. If you are creative and you're a big thinker, then you're the one who comes up with those huge, crazy visions. You could be sort of the Steve Jobs, the visionary kind of person. And then you also need the people who are good with the details, and the people who can break down a problem and solve it, and the people who can take an existing process that's working okay and find all the little tweaks to make it work even better. So there is a place for everyone with all these different skill sets, all these different strengths, and all these different types of mindsets. So it's not like there's just one personality type or one sort of profile of person of what we need. We need all these different pieces to come together to make a successful team, to make a successful company, a successful engineering project, whatever it might be. Already built into our messaging guidelines, we know we need a diversity of people, diversity of thinkers, to the diverse set of 21st century challenges. So there's a place for you in engineering that's built right into messaging guidelines C here. And some of you who submitted your funding applications would have ticked that little box. Here is a way, or we're going to give you a lot of different ways actually, to put across that message. Really land it with your participants and make sure that they have a good experience at your event that makes them feel empowered and inspired rather than feeling intimidated or I didn't really feel like that was for me, that kind of thing. We want to create more of that sort of curiosity and excitement and that spark that transcends any nervousness they might have about their own abilities. And again, there's a diversity score on the event scorecard. So those of you who took the Measuring Event Effectiveness webinar 2 weeks ago, was it 3 weeks ago? I'm losing track, will recognize this as the way that we would like you to promote diversity. So this was our first cut at the way that we want to promote diversity. And again, there's a diversity of diversities here. You can see all the different ways that the human beings in our profession, how we want them to differ in order to bring that full perspective together to create really great solutions for the future. You want to prepare before, obviously, recruiting your volunteers and speakers that can be relatable role models to a large spectrum of kids. So we could be talking about gender, we could be talking about ethnicity or race. We could also be talking about sort of the perspective that they're coming from, maybe a socioeconomic situation, or I sometimes use myself as an example. I grew up in the country, and I think it's great when you can speak in small towns because there's a certain experience that goes with growing up outside an urban environment that is a really different perspective. And I think that's, again, another example of a strength that diversity can bring to the table. Here are 3 ways that you can sort of promote diversity, and Dr. C is going to give us a whole bunch more. And afterward, obviously, we want to make sure that things landed properly. We're always interested in getting the data afterwards on how well something worked or not. So that brings me to our main event here, our main presenter, Dr. Crystal C. She works at the Center for Teaching Excellence at the University of Waterloo. I was fortunate enough to meet her when we were both presenting at the Conference for Diversity in Engineering late last year, and she's been kind enough to present a version of her talk today that we have worked together to specifically tailor for your needs as National Engineering Month outreach leaders. So she specializes in this evidence-based intervention. So that's not theory. This is looking at things that have been backed up by scientific studies, replicable trial and error trials that have been, substantiated through research. And this word interventions, you're going to hear this a lot today, basically just means a strategy that changes the situation, that changes the behavior or the reaction of the participants for the better. In this case, she's got her own personal interest in increasing the performance and representation of women and minorities in underrepresented fields. STEM fields are one of those. And I also know from poking around her LinkedIn profile that she's got a black belt in karate. So she is a force to be reckoned with, a great scientist and a presenter, and we're really happy to have her with us. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Crystal.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Erica, for the introduction. I'm really excited to be here today, and it was a lot of fun working with Erica on this talk. So I want to start off by reading a quote by Henry Ford, and he says, "Whether you think you can or you think you can't, you're right." And this quote really speaks to kind of the heart of what I'm going to be talking about today. So as a social psychologist, we're interested in gaps. So these could be gaps in achievement, gaps in performance, gaps in representation. And so as an example, this is a graph looking at reading achievement test results from the National Assessment of Educational Progress Report. So this is data from the United States. And this is data looking at reading achievement levels from the 1970s all the way up until the early 2000s. And you can see that there's been a persistent gap in reading achievement between white and black students. Similar to this, I'm also interested in gaps in representation across different occupations. So this is data from Statistics Canada from the 2006 census. You can see on the very left-hand side of the graph that men and women comprise about 50% of the labor force. However, when you get down to professions such as the physical sciences, computer professionals, technical occupations, the natural and applied sciences, and as well relevant today, engineers, you can see that women are less well represented in these professions. And speaking of engineers, this is a photo composite that I just got off of Google. And you can see that the class composite graduating class here of engineering, that you can see that there are very few women represented in this photo. So you can see that you can just kind of count on, the palm of your hand the number of women in this class composite. And I come from the University of Waterloo. We have a very large engineering program, and when I walk around the halls in engineering buildings, I look at those composites, and it looks quite similar as well. So if we want to look at actual kind of enrollment data, this is data that I got from the Faculty of Engineering at the University of Waterloo from 2012. And this is the percentage of women who are undergraduate students in engineering. And you can see that for some departments, such as architecture, environment, management, systems design, that women are pretty well represented at about between 30 and 55%. However, where you see really a lack of women, about 10% or less, is departments such as computer, electrical, mechanical, mechatronics, and software engineering. Now, if you look all of this data across and do an average and look at it across Canada, the statistic is about 20%. 20% of are women who are enrolled in these undergraduate programs. And if you look at professional engineers in Canada, it's about 9% women. And if you look at the statistic worldwide, it's about 13%. And so what are some explanations to account for why this kind of gap in representation? And I'm going to list a few different explanations that people have kind of thought of. People have talked about innate differences. Perhaps there are kind of biological sex differences that might account for this gap. Perhaps these groups don't work hard enough, they aren't motivated, perhaps they're just no interest in these fields. But as a social psychologist, we're very much interested in the situational factors that might explain, again, these gaps. So, for example, things such as socioeconomic status, people's access to higher education, that might be one factor. The influence of parents and teachers as well, so how parents kind of raise their children, how teachers behave in the classroom, and how they treat their students. And as well as the media, so how are women and how are minority groups represented in the media, such as film, in magazines, etc. And one thing that we're particularly interested in is specific aspects of this testing situation itself. So looking at exam situations or kind of high-stress situations, what aspects of those situations bring out perhaps why we see these performance differences or differences in representation. And so one research example that I always love talking about is spatial skills. So spatial skills are very much, we use them in everyday life. We use them to navigate, to read maps, to put together things from a blueprint, to do advanced math. And for a very long time, researchers have found a very persistent gender difference between for spatial skills, such that women and young girls underperform on spatial skills compared to men. And so, is this actually an innate difference? And so what these researchers did at the University of Toronto was they wanted to see how experience, how training can affect women's performance on spatial skills. And so what they did was they brought groups of men and women to come into the lab, and they asked them they assigned them to two different conditions. In one condition, they were playing an action video game, very much like the picture I have here, a first-person shooter, for example, that would employ their spatial skills. And the other half of participants, men and women, were assigned to play a video game that was non-action, that wouldn't use their spatial skills. And they're asked to play these video games for about 10 hours. And afterwards, they were administered a battery of spatial skills tests. So, for example, they were administered the mental rotation task. It's very simple. Students sit in front of a computer, and they look at these shapes, these kind of Tetris-like shapes, and they're asked to identify which of the shapes on the right match the ones on the left because they've been rotated. And so that was one of the ways that they assessed spatial skills. And so what they found was, in the condition in which they were training for 10 hours on a video game that used their spatial skills, these action video games, women's performance caught up to men. And this improvement in performance lasted even 5 months after the training. So this experiment really kind of illustrates that it's not just about these biological or sex differences that account for the gap or kind of differences in performance, that the testing situation and that experience really does matter. And so another thing I'm going to talk about, another aspect of the testing situation is what we call stereotypes. And so stereotypes we define as these overgeneralized beliefs about different groups. And so I'm sure all of you can think of different stereotypes in your mind. There are stereotypes of older adults and elderly, what they're capable of, stereotypes that people who wear glasses are nerds, stereotypes that white men can't dance, and also more relevant here, the stereotype that girls aren't good at math. Okay. And so this stereotype that women don't do well in these quantitative fields in math and in STEM can be perpetuated even in the kinds of clothes that are marketed towards girls. And so I have a lot of female colleagues who have daughters of their own, and they always kind of complain to me about the kinds of clothes that are available to their kids when they go to the mall. And so you can see here some of the shirts are pretty ridiculous. I'm too pretty to do math. That their best subjects are shopping and music, but not math. And these stereotypes are also perpetuated in the kinds of toys that are marketed towards girls. So I remember, when I was a little kid, I just had a blue box, a huge box of Lego to play with, whereas now when I walk into a toy store and I'm looking for Lego for my nieces and nephews, that it's quite gender segregated, such that the Lego that's marketed towards girls are in these, bright pink boxes, and they're often about very kind of girly or traditionally feminine things, such as, cooking or going to the mall, and things like that. Another example is I'm going to show you a video of what this Barbie doll is called. She's called Teen Talk Barbie, and she was made in the early 90s, highly criticized because of a specific thing that she says. So I'm just going to play this.
That wasn't tough. Party dresses are fun. I'll always be here to help you. Do you have a crush on anyone? That wasn't tough.
So, the Barbie is saying, math class is tough. Do you want to go shopping for party dresses? Do you have crushes on anyone? So again, very stereotypical, very feminine things. And so this Barbie was highly criticized, and eventually they took the talking chip out of her and kind of removed this one phrase, math class is tough. Another thing I did was I entered the word engineer into Google, and I wanted to look at the image results that came up. So these are the first 15 results that come up in Google. And so, when you look at these pictures, you can see that it's very stereotypical kind of representation of what an engineer is. All of them are wearing hard hats. All of them have kind of blueprints in their hands, which really doesn't represent the broad spectrum of things that engineers can do. Another thing to notice, too, is that there's one woman represented in this photo and these photos, and as well, there's not much ethnic diversity either. And so you can imagine that as outreach leaders yourselves, that your audience, so your participants, your students, the kids that you're working with, this might be kind of their picture, their perception of what an engineer is, what an engineer looks like and what they do, and you could do very well in kind of changing their perceptions of what an engineer actually does. So I'd like you to just imagine for a moment that you're giving a presentation in front of your coworkers or your classmates for the very first time. Naturally, you're pretty nervous. Your palms are sweating a little bit. You're shaking a little bit. And right at the beginning of your presentation, you stumble through your words, and you kind of have to compose yourself before you continue the presentation. And what happens, though, is as you look into your audience, you might notice some people looking at you differently. Perhaps some of your coworkers are kind of giggling at the back, and you're not sure about what. But you start to wonder, is it my accent, or is it because of the clothes that I'm wearing? And each time then that you do any kind of public speaking, you're perhaps scared that you're seen through the lens of a negative stereotype. And that can kind of affect your performance in other domains that are important to you, this anxiety and this stress. So the next time that you go and do a job interview, next time you meet someone new for the first time, this anxiety can kind of take up your working memory and make you underperform. And this experience is what we call stereotype threat. So it's this fear that you're confirming a negative stereotype, and that can affect your performance. And so you can imagine that a woman in engineering might feel the same way, that she's afraid that when she's in a testing situation, if she's presentation, going to a job interview, that she might be seen through the lens of a negative stereotype that women don't do well at math and other quantitative fields. And that can affect not only her test performance, but perhaps her job interviews and her prospects, what she perceives as her prospects for continuing and being successful in engineering. And so stereotype threat then is when a person is placed in a situation where they are aware of a negative stereotype that's attached to their group. And because of that, they're under this extra pressure to avoid confirming this negative stereotype, and that can often lead to underperformance and withdrawal from that field. So if you can imagine, the last time perhaps you choked in your performance, so whether it was in academics or whether it was in sports, that choking experience is very much what stereotype threat feels like. Or if you can imagine that you studied really hard for a test and you went into the exam room and you completely blank. That could be another kind of analogy for what stereotype threat feels like. And a lot of research since then has kind of looked at these mechanisms, and stereotype threat can really, for example, take up people's working memory so they don't do as well cognitively, or it can get students to engage in very problematic test-taking strategies. So for example, they might double-check, triple-check, or triple-check their answers, which doesn't give them enough time to complete the whole test. That could lead to their underperformance. So I'm going to show you some data from one study. This is kind of the landmark kind of pioneering study of the effect of stereotype threat, and these effects have been replicated and conceptually replicated hundreds of different times. And so in this study, this is done by my advisor and his colleagues, I was looking at women in math. They brought both male and female participants to come into the lab, and they asked them to do a pretty challenging math test. So these items were actually taken from the GRE, the standardized math test. And the male and the female participants were assigned to two different conditions. Half the participants were placed in the high stereotype threat condition. And so in this condition, they're told that this test, this math test that they're about to do, has shown gender differences in the past. And whereas the other half of participants were told in the low stereotype threat condition, were told that, this test has shown no gender differences in the past. And then they go ahead, both groups do the exact same tests, same questions, and what the researchers were interested in was how they did. How did they do on this very challenging math test? So take in mind in the high stereotype threat condition, they're not explicitly told that, traditionally men do better than women on this test, but you can imagine that if you're a woman and you're doing this test and you're aware of this negative stereotype, that you might make the assumption then that men probably did better than women, thus kind of evoking feelings of stereotype threat. So turning to the results, on the y-axis is your score on this math test, controlling for things such as past SAT scores. And you can see that in the high stereotype threat condition, women underperform compared to men. But in the low stereotype threat condition, women perform just as well as men. And so remember that this is the exact same test, and it's really just the messaging that's slightly different for these two conditions. So again, these results are kind of replicated not just for women in math, but for minorities in different academics, such as reading and math and other things. And so since then, social psychologists have looked at the different downstream consequences of stereotype threat. So as we just talked about, stereotype threat can lead to underperformance, whether it's academics, whether it's sports, etc. And again, it can trigger concerns about belonging. So it can get people to kind of question whether or not they belong in the field, whether or not they're doing well, whether or not they should continue, which can then lead to lower engagement, so lower motivation, lower participation rates, lower engagement, and retention as well. So people could decide to switch majors and go into another field altogether. And lastly, because of these fears of belonging and again lower engagement, it can also lead to even kind of negative health effects. And so I want you now to picture two different runners who are running a race. They run a preliminary race together and they finish in the exact same time. But one of these people, the person on the left here, you notice is wearing ankle weights and the other person is not, but they finish in the exact same time. Now, if these two same runners run in the final race, what would you imagine? I mean, who would win? And presumably the person with the ankle weights should win. And that's because the runner with the ankle weights has more running ability. And even though, the first performances were equal in time, the one on the left did it with the external pressure of weights kind of holding him or her back. And so this type of situation arises more than you think, so not with ankle weights necessarily, but with other external environmental pressures holding back the performance. And so because of stereotype threat, because of these negative stereotypes about women in math and other stereotypes, these pressures actually underestimate their ability. And if these pressures are removed, they can perform even better. And so what my advisor and his colleagues did was looked at data across over 15,000 students across 5 different countries and did a meta-analysis and looked at their intellectual test performance, so that's on the y-axis, and compared it across 3 different kind of conditions. So you can see that there's a classic achievement gap between non-stereotype students, that's the solid line there, and stereotype students in threat conditions, the dotted line, such that stereotype students underperform compared to non-stereotype students. However, when they're looking at data where the stereotype students are performing in what they call safe conditions, where stereotype threat might be removed in those situations, you can see that they do just as well or even better compared to the non-stereotype students. And so this shows us then that perhaps our assumptions about women or visible minorities having less ability is just plain false. And we remove those biases and remove those ankle weights, for example, they perform every bit as well or even better. And so we know that this gap, this achievement gap in this underrepresentation is worth working to close, because we could lose a lot of performance of those students. So we could lose their contributions to engineering, and they could represent things like new designs, new inventions, new improvements to processes, and new ideas that we could have had if we were looking at things a bit differently. And so some things to consider kind of moving forward as you plan your outreach events, looking at current ones, looking at future ones, is perhaps where can stereotype threat appear in my current initiatives and strategies, and how can my current initiatives and strategies be more effective? And so this is where I'm going to talk a lot about these WISE social psychological interventions. So again, these social psychological interventions are these strategies that you could use to kind of reduce the effects of stereotype threat. One thing to note is that you don't have to worry and kind of have to think about completely revamping your current programming or anything like that. A lot of these interventions are quite simple and very subtle and brief, and I'll explain why. And so Greg Walton and colleagues, they're kind of the researchers spearheading this field, is that these interventions or these strategies that you use should be precise. And what I mean by precise is that these interventions should be backed up by theory, backed up by research, and that they should be tailored to that specific context. And so as outreach leaders, you know your context, you know your audience, so it would be good to kind of think about how to best tailor your messaging to fit with your target group. Another thing is that why social psychological interventions tend to be subtle. So they are subtle. They're not meant to kind of highlight that there's an intervention going on, because the thing is you don't want to put the spotlight on a minority group or the women in your group, because that can tokenize them, that can really threaten their feelings of belonging. Another thing is that they should be brief, so it shouldn't be extensive or repeated over long periods of time, because that can really undermine the credibility of your message, and it can also send the message to your students that, wow, you guys need a lot of help. Another thing is, what we found is that these interventions are most successful when they're self-generated and relatable. And so in some of the interventions I've talked about is that the intervention itself is made by the students or the participants themselves. So whether it's they're perhaps writing a letter to another student about engineering and their experiences in engineering. And the last thing about why social psychological interventions is that they set off what we call a recursive process. And so what we found with these interventions is that they're quite brief, and you do them just once, and you can see these kind of long-lasting effects. And why is that? And social psychologists hypothesize it's because it sets off this recursive process. So you change someone's narrative, you change their personal story, you change how perhaps they might interact with someone else, how they interpret a failure or success, increases their confidence, and when they interact or go for a job interview the next time, they do much better. So it's this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy, this effect that kind of keeps going. And so I'm going to be talking about several different interventions. We've kind of split them up into interventions for K-12 and interventions for college and university students. That's not to say that these interventions couldn't be applied across all these groups, but we've kind of targeted them so that it makes it easier to process. So for interventions or strategies for K-12 students, what research has shown is that role models and mentors are super important. And so researchers have found is that having a female role model, having kind of a female expert to look up to, they often act as kind of a vaccine. They inoculate them against the effects of stereotype threat and can improve their performance. So even just having a female mentoring program or the fact that you have a woman administering a test versus a man, that can increase performance. And so what it means is that these mentoring opportunities can really happen naturally when you have female and minority leaders and facilitators. And so what you can do as an outreach leader and event organizers is that whenever possible, let the women and minority leaders lead the activities and address your event participants. It's important to note that it's not necessary to mention why. Again, you don't want to draw attention to it. You want the intervention to be kind of as subtle as possible. A caveat to that, though, is that having super girly, quote-unquote girly, or traditionally feminine role models can backfire. What it means is that when you accentuate kind of girly things to try to appeal to girls, that can actually negatively affect girls' motivation. So, for example, Barbie came out with Computer Engineer Barbie. She was all kind of dressed up and dolled up in pink. You can think about IBM. They recently had a Hack a Hairdryer campaign that drew a lot of criticism. And so what you can do, again, is to choose or to have available just relatable role models with accomplishments outside of work. And so in some research, they found that with elementary school girls, when they met different female scientists, the ones who met female scientists that they felt that they had stuff in common with and that those role models had accomplishments in lives outside of work, those girls were the ones who were most likely to express interest in pursuing sciences. And as well, when you're using examples and talking about different things, make sure that they're not specifically gendered. So you could talk about anything from music and movies, the environment, creativity, solving big problems, helping people. These are things that, again, that are not specifically gendered that can appeal to a broad audience. So really what's important here is having relatable role models. Another intervention strategy is reconceptualizing intelligence and ability and kind of fostering what Carol Dweck and her colleagues at Stanford University call a growth mindset versus a fixed mindset. And so her work really was based on her research where they went into elementary schools and they observed different kids who had either a growth mindset, so kids with a growth mindset kind of view the brain as a muscle that can grow and that putting in effort is a good thing and that they can learn from their failure. This is what we call a growth mindset. And so what it means is that emphasizing the importance of effort, the importance of persistence, and gradual improvement over time instead of just looking at immediate results, innate ability, or things like talent, that can really make a safe environment for your participants. And so what you can do then is really powerful is to share stories of your own failure and how you recovered from that failure. So talking about perhaps a time that you didn't do so well and what you learned from it. Wherever possible, to mention the importance of continuing to improve and to grow your brain. Again, viewing your brain as something that can grow, something that kind of acts like a muscle. And you can say things such as, keep trying, working hard, and you'll get it. Everyone makes mistakes at the beginning, and again, asking what can you learn when things don't go well. So it's really, again, looking at failure in a different way, looking at it as an opportunity to learn from. Another intervention is emphasizing high standards and assuring your participants that they can meet these standards. And so this is based on research looking at minority students in the States, where when they were given feedback on a writing assignment, for example, from the professor, if they were just given critical feedback that lowered their motivation, they didn't do so well. However, if they were given this critical feedback with the professor saying, like, I have high standards, but I'm very sure that you can meet these standards, that actually increased their motivation and their identification with the writing task and their performance. So what it means is that having high standards for your participants indicate that, these students, these participants, they won't be judged based on a negative stereotype that they may be aware of, and that they are capable of reaching these standards. So what you can do then is perhaps during your events, don't give up on kids who don't get it right away. Encourage them, but don't change the task for them. So it's not about lowering the bar, lowering standards. And say things such as, I know this is a challenge, but I know you can do it. Or, the engineering and technology professions need you to help solve important problems. And another kind of strategy is to show that you value diversity. And so what it means is that being colorblind or being gender blind can actually discourage minorities and women from entering STEM fields. And so in a lot of social psychological research has shown that perhaps, for example, when people are exposed to companies that claim that they're colorblind, but they actually don't have they don't have a very diverse company in terms of their employees, that they come to kind of mistrust this company, and it makes them feel less excluded. Less included. However, showing that you value diversity can actually have the opposite effect. It has a more positive effect. So what you can do is very simply make sure that you show diversity in the photos that you use, for example, in your promotional materials. Talk about encouraging, embracing, and valuing diversity. So you can do this by saying things such as, we need everyone's contributions, join us, there's a place for you. And so really, it's not about, being very explicit about, well, yeah, we make sure that, we have a diverse workforce, but by saying things such as you appreciate and value different perspectives and viewpoints. And so that can often make people feel welcome. And also in the kind of language that you use, so making sure that your language is inclusive. So for example, using he and she equally as you address people and talk about and talk it during your event. And lastly, for interventions for K-12, it's really important to model respect for women and minorities. So this is just based on preliminary work that myself and my colleagues are doing here at the University of Waterloo. And what it means is that when men and majority group members show respect for women and minorities, participants can perform better, they feel included, they feel valued, they feel respected, and that can really make them perform better. And so what you can do is have women and minorities speak, lead, or co-lead whenever possible, and to listen when they speak. Or perhaps asking women and minorities for advice or help in front of your audience. And so again, these things are, again, quite subtle. You don't need to kind of make this a very explicit thing. The fact that these small gestures, like asking for advice and listening and valuing their contributions can make a difference. So moving on to interventions for university and college students. One big thing that university and college students deal with is a lot of stress, especially when you're in your first year of your program. And so research has shown that how you cope with stress can really make a difference in your performance. So whether you appraise your feelings, so whether it's anxiety, nervousness, etc., as challenge, that can be a good thing, versus a threat that can lead to kind of underperformance. And so what it means is that any kind of anxiety or nervousness that people feel can be either harnessed as a positive thing, so this anxiety can kind of get you ready to do well, or it can be reframed as something that's normal. It's normal to feel anxious and nervous. And so what you can do is perhaps talk about overcoming challenges. You can say things such as, even if it's hard, you can do it, take this on as a challenge. Another intervention kind of strategy for university college students is what we call belonging. How do we increase people's kind of sense of belonging in the field that they are in? And what it means is in these intervention strategies is that anxiety and concerns about belonging, you tell them that it's normal, that it's temporary, and that it can be overcome. So any kind of anxiety perhaps a woman feels about belonging in the field of engineering, we want to kind of change the personal narrative, change their story, so that any concerns that they have, it's not about their gender or about their race. It's something that everyone experiences. So what you can do is to encourage and reassure wherever possible. What's really powerful is telling your own stories of struggling in engineering school, if you did, and say things such as, stress is not about you, it's hard for everyone, and it gets better. And so in this particular intervention, it was done at the University of Waterloo for first-year students, and it was very simple. Both male and female students were shown a video of an upper-year engineering student talking about their anxiety and the concerns and their stress that they experienced in their first year, but how it was normal that they overcame those anxieties and concerns over time, and they did well. And so just by watching this video at the beginning of the year, they monitored the female students' grades, and they increased by the end of the year, especially for students who were in majors where there are less than 20% women represented in the department. And female students reported prospects for doing well in engineering, continuing in engineering. That also increased 6 months after. And lastly, I'm going to talk a little bit about self-affirmation. So this is a study done by Cohen and colleagues where they went into middle schools, and it was a very simple exercise they did at the beginning of the year. What they did was they asked students to sit for about 10 to 15 minutes and write about a value that was important to them. So it could be, belonging to a social group. It could be about the environment, causes that they care about. It could be about belonging to a sports group, belonging to a religious group, being a good friend. It didn't matter what a value was about. So they just sat and they wrote about it. And what they did was that they monitored their grades throughout the year, and the achievement gap between white and black students had closed quite a bit just by the end of the first year. What this means is that minority students and women's performance can improve when they're given the opportunity to reflect on their values. So what you can do is perhaps encourage participants to think about things that matter most to them, or asking them things like, what are you most passionate about? What happens, and what social psychologists theorize why self-affirmation works, is that when you connect people to their broader values, to things that are that matter to them, that they have a greater sense of self-integrity, and they feel more well-equipped to take on challenges and stress. So related to self-affirmation, the National Academy of Engineering had the grand challenges for engineering, and engineers from around the world kind of identify different challenges for engineering. And you can see here from the screenshot that these topics ranged quite a bit. They're quite broad, from things such as education, the brain, medicine, infrastructure, etc. And so one good way to kind of increase interest, increase kind of intrinsic motivation to continue to pursue engineering is getting students to think about and to be excited about what happens after they graduate from engineering, and getting them to think about how they can help solve problems that matter most to them. And so some of the take-home messages for you guys as outreach leaders and event organizers is that your participants may experience stereotype threat during your event. And stereotype threat can happen, it can kind of lurk in people's minds no matter what you do as an event organizer. But you can kind of try to help reduce or eliminate it with some of these wise social psychological interventions that I talked about. Taking in mind that they should be precise, kind of backed up by research and theory, that they should be subtle and brief, and when possible, generated by participants themselves to have kind of a longer and more powerful impact. And so to summarize some of the strategies to reduce stereotype threat that you can think about incorporating is, again, when possible, providing positive, relatable role models or examples, setting and keeping high standards for your participants and assuring them that you know that they can meet these high standards. When possible, to promote a growth mindset instead of a fixed mindset. So again, getting your students and your participants to think about the brain like a muscle, and something that can grow. demonstrate how diversity is valued, whether it's showing kind of diverse photos in your promotional materials or making sure that you have women and minority leaders. Modeling respect for women and minorities and making sure that their contributions are valued. Having students reframe their anxiety and stress as normal, that's temporary and can be overcome over time. And lastly, to provide opportunities for self-affirmation and reflection. So again, really connecting students to the values that they care most about. So if you're interested in more of what I've talked about, I have a page here with some resources and references. So at the top here we have some large-scale education initiatives. So a lot of social psychologists have teamed up with different universities and educators to come up with different kind of solutions that can be implemented at these different universities. If you're interested in reading more about stereotype threat and all the research that's been done on it for the past couple decades, there's a link to that as well. If you're interested in kind of the growth mindsets, that's been taking off as well. And if you're interested in reading more about the research around these psychological interventions, I've included some links to some articles. And I'll hand it off to you, Erica.
Thank you so much, Crystal. Just a ton of great information there. And if you're like me at this point, you're wondering, okay, I could try this, I could do this. You can sort of see some of these strategies and ways that you could adopt them, weave them into the plan that you have for your engineering and technology outreach event. And you might be wondering, how are we going to figure out if this works or not? Like any good experiment, even though we're not professional researchers like Crystal, we can run our own experiments and see if these interventions, if the way that we're able to integrate them is effective for our participants. I want to remind you that we do have the participant surveys that you're going to be printing out and handing out on the day of your event. Very simple survey, one page front and back with just a few quick questions, and that does track gender, so you'll be able to tell whether your messages were landing properly with any, with either gender. There are just a couple sort of highlights, I guess, that I really like personally. First of all, here's a screenshot of one of our participant surveys from 2014. This is a 13-year-old girl who says that engineering and technology are fun, cool, and interesting. So I think we did, the event organizer did a very good job in that case of getting rid of any sort of feelings of intimidation or, what could have been a stereotype threat situation and making it into something positive and inspiring and fun. There was another one here. What did you find exciting or interesting about this activity? I like the rush I had when the gears made the wheels move. So that was actually one of my workshops that I facilitated with a group of brownies, and they were having the hardest time getting their solar vehicles to work. We were holding them up to the light. We were, trying to put the gears together, and for whatever reason, it just wasn't happening. I was starting to get really worried, but they finally did figure out how to do it. So that was a wonderful sort of victory for them. And you can see that again, this is the same session. You fail many times and then you finally get it right. So it was really cool to see some of the same themes being echoed through the literature, the scientific research that's coming through on these topics. And this is a really great opportunity. So I encourage you to use your surveys, get them into the participants' hands after you've finished your activity and see what they have to say. I guarantee it's a really fun and interesting, very rewarding way to get that feedback and know whether your strategies and your interventions are landing properly. So again, just a couple of other examples. Make stuff, solve problems, help change the world. That's exactly what we're all about here. And, as someone who went through the entire, K-12 system through my engineering degree and then out into the engineering workforce, I think about the times when I maybe managed not to succumb to a sense of I can't do this, but really I did stick with it, and ended up having some success. I think it was from a sense of, well, I don't know if I can do it, but it's worth it to try because the thing I want to do is way cooler. It's worth the risk of trying. So you maybe don't ever totally get confident, but you at least see something that's exciting enough and inspiring enough to jump into. So emphasizing those big, interesting problems, those big, important challenges of our time, like climate change, like some of those other grand challenges, that's very much in line with our strategy of how we want to motivate and inspire all kinds of young people, regardless of where they come from, what gender, what ethnic diversity, what ethnic group they are, all that sort of thing. So that brings us to the end of the content that we're presenting to you. I want to give you a couple of reminders. Because bringing in a guest speaker and talking a little more extensively about diversity was something we haven't done before, we'd really love to get your feedback. We want to thank you for taking the time to listen to this presentation, to participate, and we'd like to get some feedback from you. So it'll be a very quick survey, I promise. We'll send that link around and get some of your thoughts on it. Exactly 6 days from now, we are going to be doing a kickoff webinar. Can't believe March is just around the corner, and encourage you to come out and get a sense of what's going on in the broader campaign. You know, we know you've all been really busy working on your events and making sure everything's perfect for the big day. Take a moment and look up at the broader context of what you're a part of, because it's pretty darn cool. We think there are somewhere between 500 and 1,000 people altogether, volunteers giving their time to make National Engineering Month happen, and you're going to reach tens of thousands of people, and you're awesome, and you deserve to take a moment and look at the bigger picture and celebrate what we're making happen. Huge thanks to our presenter, Dr. Crystal Tse. She's, as you can tell, a very knowledgeable researcher, and a lot of, I think it really speaks to the strength of the program at the University of Waterloo, that a lot of this research is going on right there, and that she's personally been a part of a lot of these studies and knows so much about the field. So thank you very much, Dr. Tse, for taking so much time to create a very tailored and very practical, tangible presentation for our event organizers. So I will now open the floor to questions and feedback from the people on the line. Thanks so much for coming.